Good afternoon. I'm Joyce DeLeo, the Vice President of Academic Affairs, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of our students, our staff, and our faculty to the start of the 2012-2013 academic year with this opening convocation. I'd like to especially welcome the class of 2016. Now I'd like to ask Douglas Dame, class of 2013, who was the regional alternate winner of the 2012 Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival's Music Theater Initiative, to come to the stage. Doug will perform Make Them Hear You from the musical Ragtime. Doug?
Go out and tell your story, let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you, make them hear you. How justice was our battle, and how justice was denied. Make them hear you, make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we chose to fight, that sometimes there are battles which are more than black or white. And I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Go out and tell your story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you, make them hear you. And tell them in our struggle we were not the only ones. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Your sword can be your sermon, or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. Make them hear you. When they hear you, I'll be near you again.
Please be seated. Thank you so much, Doug. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Monica Sheddick, class of 2013 and Student Government Association President, who will lead us in an opening prayer.
Good morning. I'm Monica Sheddick, President of Student Government Association, and I'm very happy to be here with you all today. After I say the opening prayer, I will invite all of you to a moment of silence in remembrance of 9/11. Please stand for the opening prayer. Today, suddenly, words fail me when it comes to prayer. For me, prayer is an emotional connection. I know that prayer is different for all of us, and that we see God in our own ways. God may be seen by some of us in a beautiful sunset, in our close relationships, or in the best and worst of times. Maybe words fail you as well at this particular time. But today, given its importance, namely the official opening of school, as well as the remembrance of 9/11, it may be easier for us to discover God in our community, meaning everybody around us, as we convene to open another academic year. We can use our education in expanding our collective wisdom to work for peace and to assure that peace does prevail, and that 9/11 will be an honored memory. I'm not exactly sure how to say this, but we need to express our gratitude and thanks to our God for the community that we share, the wisdom that we are gaining, and for the relationships that we have developed. So let's join together in a moment of silence and meet God in the quiet of our hearts. Thank you. Please be seated.
Thank you very much, Monica. It is now my pleasure to introduce the president of Emmanuel College, Sister Janet Eisner, SND. Thanks to Sister Janet's dynamic and inspiring leadership over the past 3 decades, Emmanuel is providing an outstanding liberal arts and sciences education today to a record number of undergraduate and graduate students. Sister Janet is a graduate of Emmanuel, holds a master's degree from Boston College and a PhD from the University of Michigan. She has also received many local, regional, national, international honors and awards in recognition of her many, many achievements. I'm very privileged and honored to work closely with Sister Janet. Sister Janet.
Thank you, Jess. So it is certainly a joy to welcome all of you to this academic convocation and the opening of our 94th academic year. As we know, this is an important tradition, a convocation, which dates back to the earliest years of the college. So let me recognize first our students. I invite the class of 2013, our senior class, to stand. Class of 2013, our seniors, you donned your graduation robes at the Mass of the Holy Spirit last evening, and now you wear them again. You will wear these again in October at the cap and gown investiture ceremony, where you'll be formally invested in the final stage of the baccalaureate. So congratulations to the class of 2013. Be seated. Thank you. I'm also delighted to welcome our class of 2014, our junior class, the sophomore class, class of 2015. You are now preparing, class of 2015, to declare your interest in a particular area of study. And I welcome again the class of 2016, our freshman class, whom we welcomed warmly to the college in this very gym just a week or so ago. So we welcome all our students from other programs as well, our graduate programs, our dedicated faculty, administrators, and staff. So as Monica reminded us, this is an important day for remembering. And I think particularly of our students, as we did those 11 years ago at the college. And I think that you were probably 7 years old, or maybe 10 years old if you're a senior. And so it has a very different meaning in terms of the context of being in college. But nevertheless, I'm delighted that we took the time to reflect then, as we do as we walk through our quad. We are certainly looking forward to a very exciting academic year. And I think I would add my words to the beautiful song that was sung for us by a member of our own student body and say, we hope that we will have our ears open as well and help other voices to be heard. So we hope we will hear all the voices that come to us and prepare ourselves as well to speak with clear voice, clear conscience, to resound throughout our own lives and those around us, to continue all that is good. And so I welcome you to today's convocation.
Thank you, Sister Janet. I want to first thank our EC Reads Committee, especially Lori Johnston, Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies, the previous chair of this committee, and Claire Mehta, Assistant Professor of Psychology, the current chair of this committee, for all of their efforts in choosing both our EC Reads summer book, Zaytun, and our keynote speaker for this year, as well as the work involved in organizing today's schedule. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce our 2012-2013 Academic Convocation keynote speaker, Dr. Sheri Fink. Dr. Fink received her BS in psychology with highest distinction from the University of Michigan and her MD and PhD in neuroscience from Stanford University. As someone who has trained and mentored many PhD and MD, PhD students over the last 20 years, I greatly admire and respect Dr. Fink's career path. Her experience while a medical student as a research fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of California at Berkeley Institute for International Studies helped shape her unique career. She chose a path less traveled, but I would argue a path with a much greater impact than many physician scientists experience. Knowing the medical community personally, I am certain it took much courage and confidence for Dr. Fink to pursue the direction she did. After medical school, Dr. Fink served on numerous humanitarian health teams throughout the world, including Kosovo, Russia, Afghanistan, Israel, Pakistan, Indonesia, and closer to home, New Orleans. Not only does Dr. Fink utilize her medical training to provide emergency medical assistance, but she is also an articulate and powerful voice for medical rights, global health, and ethics. She has reported and published extensively on bioethics, torture, healthcare, medicine, and science. Dr. Fink's book, War Hospital, A True Story of Surgery and Survival, won the American Medical Writers Association Special Book Award and was a finalist for the Overseas Press Club and Penn Martha Albrand Nonfiction Awards. Her article, published in the New York Times Magazine in 2009, The Deadly Choices at Memorial, which chronicled the aftermath at a hospital in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, was a winner of the 2010 Pulitzer Prize in Investigative Reporting. This article, along with the book by David Eggers, Zaytoon, was part of our summer reading. I hope you had the opportunity to read both this book and Dr. Fink's article. These readings demonstrated how basic human survival standards and ethical decision-making can make a gray area when individuals are faced with an emergency. Our mission at Emmanuel College is to educate students in a dynamic learning community rooted in the liberal arts and sciences and shaped by strong ethical values, a commitment to social justice and service, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and the global mission of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. This convocation address marks the beginning of our engagement in ethical discussions and values across our community this academic year. For the first-year students newly coming to Emmanuel, I want to quote a passage from my remarks from last year's convocation. As you begin your experience here at Emmanuel, I ask you to question what may not seem right. Be the one in a group that questions the ethics of a situation. Be the critical thinker. Be the leader. Grow not only intellectually, but consider your role as a person here in this college, in this incredible city, and in the larger community. How will you make a difference? I look forward to hearing Dr. Fink's talk on these important issues. Dr. Fink?
Hello. I'd also like to start by thanking the EC Reads Committee and Dr. DeLeo and Sister Eisner, Monica Chaddick, Ellen Mendonca, the Student Government Association representatives, the honored administrators and faculty, and all of the new students and the old students and the family members here for letting me join you for this occasion. It's an inspiration to be here as you begin a year of focus on a topic that's very near to my heart, ethics in emergencies. And it feels particularly apropos to discuss disaster medical ethics at a Catholic college. Catholic moral philosophers have played a major role shaping modern medical ethics in this country for all of us, and have contemplated many of the issues raised by the events that we'll be discussing today. Respect for human dignity, the sacredness of life, stewardship of medical resources, the dedication to relieve suffering, and the attempt to find meaning in it, and a special compassion for the most vulnerable. 2 weeks ago, the night before Hurricane Isaac's expected arrival in New Orleans, I visited the hospital that I had written about after Hurricane Katrina. This time, as I walked its corridors late that night, things were strangely quiet. I heard some voices at last and followed them to a patient room. The door was open, the light was on, balled-up sheets were strewn across the bed. There was a partially eaten patient meal tray that sat on a rolling cart next to an IV pole, tall IV pole. But there was no patient in the room, just those voices I'd heard droning on from the television, replaying a press conference from the mayor's office about the impending storm. The intensive care unit across the campus was a hive of light and monitors around a central nursing station, but there were no patients in the patient bays. Every few seconds, a disconnected machine issued a low-pitched, throaty warning beep. The brunt of the storm was just hours away, and suddenly the wind whipped up and the building creaked. I was haunted. I flew out of that ICU and back into the lobby of the main building on the second floor. This was a place that I'd visited many times in my mind as I wrote the story about this hospital and what happened there after Katrina. I entered a small chapel with a stained glass wall that was lit from behind. There, almost exactly 7 years earlier, the bodies of dozens of men and women had been placed and blessed after they died in the heat of a darkened, powerless hospital surrounded by floodwaters. Then those tall IV poles had been used in desperation to knock out the windows to try to get any sort of breeze. Many more patients had died here than at any other similarly sized, similarly situated hospital in the drowning city. Along the way to those deaths were inadequacies in planning and response at every level of government and at private institutions. But in closest proximity to these deaths were choices made by individuals, ethical decision points. I'll talk about two of them now. One, who to rescue first as the power failed and temperatures rose and helicopters and boats arrived unpredictably. Should the most ill go first because they relied on machines like ventilators to breathe or dialysis to clean their blood because their kidneys had failed? Or should the less seriously ill patients go first? They could arguably endure more hardship, but they could be moved more quickly and might have better survival chances, making saving them a more efficient way of doing good. What about the babies in the neonatal intensive care unit who were fragile and had, if they survived, an entire life ahead of them? Or what about the elderly lying in the long-term acute care unit with multiple medical problems and poor prognoses, but who were the family matriarchs and patriarchs who had done so much for others throughout their lives, who had gained so much wisdom? What would society be without our elders? Then there were the medical professionals themselves, frightened and worn, who'd made a career of helping others and whose work would be so needed after the disaster. How about letting some of them go early? Well, it took a full day to realize that rescue was not coming quickly enough, and this wasn't just a mind experiment. These were momentous life and death decisions. Decisions made by people who, as a rule, didn't have the luxury that we do right now, sitting in this glorious, huge gym, weighing our values, pondering what's right. Most importantly, these decisions made for some 2,000 people, so many people, were made by just a few people, mostly doctors, who share a set of values and perspectives that may be different from the broader public. Which patients would you pick to go first? And which patients would you pick to go last? It's a tough question. Well, we don't contemplate this kind of triage or sorting of patients very often, but Hurricane Katrina was not unique in raising it. In fact, this very state of Massachusetts recently developed guidelines that set out which of us would get access to critical care, to ventilators, to hospital beds during a flu pandemic, when there might not be enough ventilators or critical care beds to save everyone. This is something most doctors don't even seem to know exists in the state. Well, the doctors at this hospital during Katrina decided that the patients with do not resuscitate or DNR orders would go last. They viewed them as the sickest of the sick. Now, DNR generally means that a patient or their family members have chosen not to have their heartbeats or their breathing restarted should they stop. Basically, not to go on life support. One doctor figured if patients didn't want their lives to be prolonged using extraordinary measures, then they probably wouldn't want to be saved now during Katrina at the expense of other people. But nobody asked these patients or their relatives or even told them that this decision had been made. This was arguably a violation of something called patient autonomy. It's currently considered one of the 4 key principles of biomedical ethics in this country. The idea was developed after World War II and the medical horrors of the Holocaust. So now patients must be informed and must consent to their medical treatment options. Well, the doctors seemed to feel that this would be really quite impractical in the context of a disaster. One of them later said, quote, "Informed consent is impossible in a disaster." But is it really? Certainly not every patient can be given every treatment or resource that he or she might want when these are in short supply. But doctors can still find out their preferences. Perhaps if they'd asked, some patients or their family members would have volunteered to be rescued last, freeing up spaces in helicopters and boats for those whose lives may have depended on getting out first. But instead, family members and patients found out about this decision haphazardly by overhearing the chit-chat of nurses, or they began to realize it after they saw other patients being lifted out of their beds and bed sheets and carried down the stairwells as the elevators weren't working. Some asked, "Why is my mother still in her room?" And that's when they learned the truth. Daughters begged and pleaded with the doctors and nurses to rescind those do not resuscitate orders so that their mothers could be evacuated quickly. And some of them were successful and some were not. Patients' conditions can change. With dedicated effort, even in emergencies, more resources can sometimes become available to help those whose situations at first appear hopeless. But the importance of reassessing every person's life is sometimes easy to forget in the heat of an emergency once a ranking system is assigned. The second ethical decision point came as a result of this first one. The air conditioning went out right when the storm hit. The next day, the floodwaters came up. The day after that, the hospital's backup generator failed. By Thursday of that week, employees were on their 5th day with little sleep in the humid, foul-smelling hospital. They had stopped providing all but the most basic medical and nursing care. The sickest of the sick, designated to leave the hospital last, were in terrible condition. Pets that the medical staff had brought to the hospital with them were also suffering in the heat and had to be left behind. Doctors were euthanizing them. The nurse in charge of managing the emergency, known as the incident commander, she knew this. Why, she wondered, were doctors euthanizing the pets, but not doing anything to help those patients? Most of those patients were unconscious, but still, she believed after years serving as a critical care nurse that they might somehow be experiencing suffering too. She raised this with some doctors. Couldn't they do something for these patients? Get him out, one doctor thought, and he headed up to the helipad to try to speed the evacuations. Sedate them, a veteran ICU nurse thought. She was familiar with the risks that drugs like morphine, a painkiller, and benzodiazepine sedatives could have for patients who are very fragile. They can depress the drive to breathe, they can lower blood pressure, and they can sometimes lead to death. But she figured these patients were close to death anyways, and they needed this comfort that these drugs would provide. The rule of the double effect is a Catholic theological principle that doctors in the U.S. embrace. In other words, it's considered permissible to give drugs with the goal of relieving pain, even if there's a risk that the patient might die. Should that patient die, the distinction between murder and ethical medical care would come down essentially to the intention of the person administering the drug. As that nurse injected a patient, a doctor stood beside her. He also thought the patients before them appeared close to death and wouldn't even survive an evacuation. He was terrified of what would happen to them if they were left behind in this hospital. He expected that people firing guns into the chaos of New Orleans, the animals, he called them, would storm the hospital looking for drugs after everyone else was gone. He began injecting these patients with drugs too, but he later described his intention much differently than the nurse beside him did. He told me, the goal was death. Our goal was to let these patients die. There were other doctors in the hospital who disagreed with the idea of giving the medications at all. One of them thought the patients didn't appear to be in the kind of pain that calls for sedation, let alone mercy killing. And helping patients die, he thought, is not part of a doctor's job description. It violates another one of the 4 fundamental ethical tenets of our profession, non-maleficence, the Hippocratic do no harm. In the end, around 24 patients were injected and died that Thursday afternoon at Memorial Medical Center. And they weren't only patients who were teetering at the edge of life. One was an obese, paralyzed man in his 50s. The medical professionals assumed he was too heavy to carry down the staircases. He had fed himself breakfast that morning and asked his nurse, "Are we ready to rock and roll?" What can we learn from the real-life ethical quandaries that emerge in medical settings in these extreme emergencies? Those of you who read Dave Egger's book, Zaytun, know that similar ethical quandaries came up in police work. When you're a doctor or a police officer under so much stress, even feeling that your own life is at risk, is that a time when it's okay to compromise on some of those professional ethics? Or conversely, is it a time you must cling to them even more strongly because of the temptation and perhaps even good reasons you might be drawn to violate them? Put it another way, do disasters sometimes make it necessary to break ethical rules? Or do exceptional times call for exceptional commitment to our deepest moral values? As Dr. Lachlan Foro, the Director of Ethics and Palliative Care Programs at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center once asked with regard to this very story. I believe disasters are a crucible for the kinds of challenging ethical decisions every one of us faces throughout life. Every day across the country, doctors make tough ethical choices over how to treat patients nearing the ends of their lives, about expensive care that might have some but very little chance of working, about balancing the medical ethical principle of justice, distributing resources fairly, with the principle of respecting patients' autonomy and the right to choose. Other examples in Massachusetts, is it ethical to assist a patient who wishes to commit suicide? Is it ethical for a doctor to do that? Something that's being weighed right now in this very state. You may find, as you get older and begin to move up in your own career, that there are many temptations to make compromises in your own values, ethical compromises, to get to some larger goal, even good goals, or advantage. Sometimes it's very easy to justify them and really, really hard to resist them, even when you want to. So for you students here today, entering first years and rising seniors and everyone in between, now is a particularly good moment for you to consider ethical decision making. You've chosen to attend a college like Emmanuel. You likely already have a well-developed moral sense, a framework that you've created as you learned from your families or your faith, your observations and experiences through life. And in the coming years as adults, you will leaven those values with more life experiences. You may even change some of those values for good reasons. Disasters can bring tough ethical quandaries into relief. They lend them immediacy. They help us see them more clearly. A doctor and 2 nurses who worked at that hospital after Katrina were later arrested on accusations of murdering their patients. By most reports, they had been outstanding, compassionate medical professionals until then. Abdelrahman Zaytoun cut a heroic figure paddling around his neighborhood to help others after Katrina. But as many of you now know, he was recently arrested on allegations that he offered another man money to kill his estranged wife, Kathy. He was already on probation for physically abusing her. The tale of Zaytoun, and certainly the tale I told, are extremes, but they suggest broader truths. Nobody is all good or all bad. We are all very complex and baffling mixtures. And it really is a constant struggle throughout life to be those better angels. It's not easy. Thinking about these situations in advance, as you will do throughout this year, is one way to prepare to meet the toughest dilemmas. Another, trying in the midst of whatever crisis or ethical dilemma that you face to project in your mind, how would I feel later about the decisions I'm about to make and about the impact they could have? Will you stick to your ethical principles even if you will have professional consequences in your careers? Or will you make compromises that may be soul-deadening? Now is your chance to think about who you want to be. How else can you prepare? Learn from history. Why were those patient rooms empty at the hospital when I visited just before Hurricane Isaac struck? Because the hospital's new owners had chosen to evacuate the building and close everything but the emergency room. They knew the hospital was still vulnerable to a power outage. The backup generators were not designed to power the air conditioning system if municipal electricity failed. How many hospitals in the US have a similar vulnerability or have elements of their electrical systems below flood level in a flood zone like this hospital did? Many, too many. The improvements at this particular hospital are scheduled to take place next year. So in some ways, it was really horrible that New Orleans had to face another hurricane a couple weeks ago. But it did give public officials and hospital officials a chance to do things better this time, like evacuating this hospital to protect its patients. The decision turned out to be fortunate because the hospital did lose city power for a couple of days, and the patients would have endured several days without air conditioning and might have had to be moved at that point in more difficult and immediate circumstances. Getting a second chance, making choices you wish you'd made the first time is tremendously helpful psychologically. It's hard to do things right the first time that you're faced with a tremendous challenge like this, particularly one that you've never anticipated or thought about. Life, though, doesn't always give you do-overs. And of course, once people die or suffer, nothing can erase that. Our actions really can leave indelible marks, kind of like those old images on the internet that just stay there following you for years, even when you've changed. That's why now is a key moment in your lives, going to college, becoming adults, taking responsibility for who you are and what you do. And who do you want to be? That can change. You may find, as I did, that your passions entice you to veer off the path you are on and take a different road trip. It may be a less traveled road, one with fewer lane markers, but it's where you long to be. There may be trade-offs in terms of stability of your job, security, even monetary recompense. I studied to be a doctor and a medical scientist, but a year in post-war Bosnia sent me down a different path, a path to medical aid work and ultimately medical journalism and disaster reporting. Medical journalism certainly isn't more noble than doctoring. It's just what spoke to me. The secret is there's no one right cause or passion. There are so many good things to do in the world. Your job is to discover what speaks to your hearts, what impassions you, what outrages you, what do you find just so unfair? If each one of us found that one thing and devoted some of our energies to fixing it, how much better would this world be? Don't forget, the solutions are often already out there, known by the people most affected by the problems. Be humble, Listen, invite the input of the larger community that could be affected by your decisions, even if that seems scary, even if you know what you think is right. Learn from history at the same time you bring fresh eyes and fresh creative perspectives. And a cautionary note, in the rush as young people to get where we want to be, we sometimes forget that it's important to dig down and endure the challenges of studying for exams, of doing internships, and developing the expertise and experience that we need to pursue that dream career. You might need to put aside your passions for a period, but as a wise senior student said at an orientation panel before my first year of med school, write them down. Write down what it was you wanted to do when you came here to Emmanuel, the dreams that you have for your life, the goals. Fold up that piece of paper and keep it metaphorically in your back pocket. And when exams are over, when you have a hiatus, unfold that piece of paper and remind yourself what it was ultimately that was important to you when you set down your path. This list, to quote Shakespeare, is the star to your wandering bark, the North Star you glimpse that allows you to realize when your ship is foundering and gives you the chance to write your course. As time passes, you may make changes to that list of goals and passions as you learn from life and your experiences. A young New Orleans doctor was out of town when Katrina struck. She returned and tirelessly worked to help set up community clinics that popped up all over the city to serve people whose hospitals were destroyed and whose doctors had left town. Last week, I watched her lead the city's response to Hurricane Isaac as its new health commissioner. She remembered how the elderly had died at that hospital and how almost 1 out of every 2 Katrina deaths was someone 75 or older. So as soon as the winds of Isaac died down, she wore her scrubs out into the city and went and tread these ski-slick carpets of the overheated senior high-rises that had lost power and air conditioning. She knocked on door after door of the apartments just to make sure that the elders wouldn't weaken in the heat and die like they had after Katrina. And she transferred those who were sick and who were weak to a special medical shelter set up to serve them. Her actions helped avoid the ethical quandaries that health professionals faced during Katrina, and her efforts were successful. I spoke with the New Orleans coroner last week, and this time, no New Orleanians died due to a hurricane. You have so many advantages getting this education that lies before you, being at this institution that values ethics and morals and the flourishing of your individual spirit and talents. So take what you learned here. Of all the places I've been around the world in these crazy disaster and war zones, I've seen that people, even in the midst of these awful crises, have a real chance and ability to change lives and affect lives. Even people who come from far fewer advantages than those of us who are able to get a university degree here in America. If they can do this, you can do it. We can be those agents of change, and we can make a mark in the world. We can be the people we want to be. I've seen this. As Haile Selassie said, throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most that has made it possible for evil to triumph. Let us not allow evil to triumph. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fink. Not only does that set the stage for our year of discussions about ethical dilemmas, but it also hopefully will give you, the voters of Massachusetts, some more thought to consider physician-assisted suicide, also known as death with dignity. So now, I also wanted to mention that Dr. Fink will be meeting with students and faculty this afternoon. She was gracious to stay the whole day with us to continue these important conversations. So now we conclude our program with the musical performance of the Emmanuel alma mater. I want to welcome back Dame to sing for us. Thank you.
Alma Mater, honored mother, guardian of our youth, guiding hand with thee we stand along the way of truth. Emmanuel, we hail thee, thy glorious deeds untold. We pledge our loyalty to thee. 'Neath thy banners of blue and gold.